Hello, my name is Matt Ross. I directed a movie called Captain Fantastic, which was also distributed by Bleecker Street, which is distributing James's film. And I'm here to interview James Ponsoldt to discuss his upcoming film, Summering. I think the first film I saw of yours was Smashed. Did that come out before A Spectacular Now?
It did, yeah. It came
Okay.
out a year before. Yeah.
So for people who don't know you, I mean, the films I've seen of yours are Smash, Spectacular Now, The End of the Tour, and The Circle. And I know you've directed many other things, but those are your probably the films that you're most known for, I would assume. Yeah. Can we start by you giving a sort of quick synopsis for anyone who hasn't seen the film or seen the trailer yet about about Summering?
Yeah. Summering is about four friends who are sort of about to begin middle school. It's sort of in the waning days of summer, and they make a discovery that sort of alters sort of the trajectory of what they thought their final time together would be. And the film thematically, I think, is about the fear and anxiety of getting older and losing your friends and change.
Come on. This is our last weekend before middle school. And before you know it, it'll be Monday, first period.
She's right. My mom won't let me watch all those shows you're talking about because she says it's always about men killing girls and other men saving girls or finding the dead girls they could have saved. But this is on us. This is our body.
So I would love to focus the conversation mostly on the process of the film and the craft of the film, because I'm assuming that, well, I don't know, I shouldn't assume anything about when people catch this, but I'd like to talk about the origin. First, start by talking about the origin of the story, of this particular story, what led you here, because you've made many films. This is not your first film. So what was it about this particular story, or what was the spark of it that led you to this story?
Yeah, I mean, there's always the long answer and the short answer.
Yes. Give us the 3-hour answer.
I mean, I think in some ways it's sort of a continuation of things I've always, themes I've always been interested in. Someone reminded me the other week that my thesis film in grad school was about a single mother and her daughter, Ginny Garofalo, and a younger actor.
What's that film called?
It's called Junebug and Hurricane, and it's a story where there's the surface story and sort of the subtextual story. It's on the surface, it's about a mom and a daughter in sort of the outer parts of Brooklyn around Coney Island having the best day out in the middle of winter. It's really about a mom and a daughter on the run from an abusive husband. And so that's sort of what it is sort of beneath the surface. Ben Percy, my co-writer on Summering, and I met about 15, 16 years ago at a writers conference and at the Sewanee Writers Conference. And I wound up reading a short story of his called Refresh, Refresh that was in the Paris Review originally, and then Best American Short Stories. And it was it was about young people in structural violence. It was about young men in the Pacific Northwest whose fathers are Marine reservists that have been activated and deployed. So it's a town without fathers where young men are trying to sort of, in a performative way, act as their fathers, sort of create fight clubs, video them, and then send them to their fathers who are in green zones in Iraq and Afghanistan. So sort of Lord of the Flies in the age of Skype. And that I adapted it and went to the Sundance Screenwriters Lab with it. And then in a very roundabout way, an amazing graphic novelist named Danica Novgordoff adapted my script into a graphic novel that was ultimately selected by Alison Bechtel for Best American Comics back in 2011. So all of which is to say, I think Ben and I have been thinking, I think about young people and violence and the way that it affects family structures for a long time. He and I both have similar-ish backgrounds. We're very close with moms and sisters. We both have children, have daughters. And I had reached out to him a few years ago when somebody was found dead very close to where I live. And it was an older man. He couldn't be identified. Still, I don't believe has ever been identified. And I just sort of started a conversation with him, as well as other friends, as well as my family, as well as my children, sort of about equity, justice, personal responsibility, what it means to be a neighbor, and thematic structural issues, I think related to violence that can lead to issues related to breakdown in the family structure, to domestic violence, to toxic masculinity, to people being unhoused, all of these big things. But they sort of began to sort of boil into a story about friendship, and about hope and fear at a moment where it feels really hard as a parent, certainly harder than it has been perhaps in the past, to look your kids in the eye and say, hey, everything's going to be okay. Everything's going to be fine. At a moment, I'm jumping back a couple years, to early-ish 2020. But when, my kids would ask my wife and I, do you really have to go outside? There's bad air. You might die, which feels like the stuff of speculative fiction. And I think
How old are your kids?
They are 3, 6, and 8. Yeah.
Are they all girls?
My middle child is a girl. Yeah. And then my wife actually works at a middle school, high school, like 6th through 12th grade. And so she helped found the school. So I've seen it from its beginnings. But every year there's sort of a new group of, 11 and 12-year-old girls. And sort of, I think a lot of the conversations and fears, and then sort of the conversations between parents and children. I think about friendship and the fear of losing friends, that for some kids, I think, depending on their personal experience, can be more front of mind and more palpable than the fear of death, which can still feel like an abstraction. I think those conversations between kids and parents, many of whom are struggling in their own way, to both give their children the personal freedom that they believe they have, while inevitably projecting their own anxieties, while struggling to maintain their own friendships, and God help them even try to make new friendships.
All those themes and complexities are in your film. It's interesting, the manifestation of it is very subtle. I mean, the way you're talking about it, it posits a very different film, because I think the film is ultimately very warm, and your description of it sounds like it's very traumatic, and it's actually not at all. All of that is very subtle and subtextual in a way, which is neither here nor there.
I want a more classic name. Daisy's so plain. It's like being called Dandelion. It's like I'm a weed. Maybe we should change our names when we go to middle school.
My name would be something cool, like Taylor Swift or Beyonce, but like my own thing. You'd hear it and you'd go, oh, that's cool.
I'm interested in, let's segue into casting and sort of pre-production, which is, you have 4 young women who are your leads. I'd love to talk about casting those young actresses, who they are. Let's start there.
Yeah. It sort of began with conversations with Jen Dana, who's my producing partner, and A.B. Kaufman, who's the amazing casting director that I've worked with for forever, who I think is brilliant and really is so magnificent, both at sort of painting by creating ensemble and figuring out who's going to sort of reverberate off the other actor best. And she's also, I think, in her career been really, prescient at finding younger actors before they have a long resume. It began with me talking to Avi. I mean, sharing the script with her, and just long conversations about our own relationship with our kids, her talking about her own childhood, things like that. And then because this was during the age of Zoom, we began a casting process over Zoom, where Avi and her team, who are great, began reading dozens and dozens and dozens of young actors. And great casting directors are great advocates for the actors that they believe in. So then it was sort of Avi, making introductions, us sort of meeting like this, me and the actors.
And was it a traditional process in the beginning? Insofar, I mean, casting children is a complicated equation. I mean, casting anyone is complicated, but it's additionally complicated when you're dealing with people who maybe have little or no experience. Was it a traditional process in terms of them reading from your script, doing, scene work with Avi before you got to the callback process?
Yeah, it was. And man, at some point offline, I want to pick your brain because you've obviously been through done so remarkably by it. Yeah, I mean, it was ostensibly when I would first meet the young actors, it would be for them to do some scenes. But I, because I'm long in the tooth, I mean, I would just want to talk for a while or ask questions and listen to a point where Avi had to be a timekeeper and remind me.
But that's part of the process too, learning who the person is. I mean, there's as many different kind of actors as there are people, and learning who the child is. And also the unknown equation is someone, Gina McCarthy cast Captain Fantastic, and I think it was her phrase, or said something like, when you cast the kids, you cast their parents too, which is the second stage that you may or may not know about. And I was very lucky with Captain Fantastic. We had incredible parents who really not only endorsed what we were doing, but endorsed the process, and that manifests when you're on set, obviously, tremendously. So yeah,
I mean, in those early conversations, I think a lot of it is you're trying to figure out, you have an idea of what this character is and who the right actor might be that might serve the role. I mean, there's the black in the script, the text you've written, and there's the white space in the margins. And I think what you hope for, at least for me, is that someone is going to come along that's going to capture my imagination that I just can't stop watching and I find interesting, and they create life in that white space, and they expand my notion. Perhaps they pivot my notion of what that character is or could be, where maybe it's not what I initially imagined, but something about it just becomes a sort of a snag in the brain where I'm like, they're just so interesting. And then with younger actors, a lot of it, I think, would be, meeting the young actor, Avi and I reading with them, and then Avi and I talking afterwards about how strange and wonderful and brilliant the mind is of that person, and just delighting in that.
When you were in the callback process, what were you encouraging improvisation, or were you reading with them yourself? Were you improvising with them? Was there any of that, or was Avi doing any of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, a lot of times, I mean, the ability to memorize well and the ability to be natural, especially at a younger age. Sometimes there's a Venn diagram, sometimes they're different skill sets. I mean, I guess at any age. And I think chiefly I wanted people that I thought were the most interesting and could be the most spontaneous, and whose imagination, which I think is the greatest tool an actor has, was the most vibrant and alive and surprising in a way. And
it's that really difficult balance, because you want, if there's language that's specific, you want someone to be able to craft that or replicate it in a way that we recognize as being naturalistic. But you also want, as you said, a kind of either an energy or a presence, and you want a facility with, you want them to have an ease and be able to take things in different and unexpected directions. Really what you want is living thought. You want someone to be able to just, and that's difficult at any age. I mean, there are some brilliant, we can name brilliant actors who are adults, very experienced, who don't do that. I mean, famously, no, that's not part of what they bring, and that's fine. So it's a big ask to ask for children to do that.
It is. I mean, in many ways, I mean, you're asking for people to be able to play, to let go, to be spontaneous, to yes and whatever is going to be presented to them in the moment, to be present.
Not worry about being good, whatever that is. Yeah.
Definitely, that's a curse of death, I think. And I think with adult actors as well, I think in many ways, I'm probably paraphrasing someone who said it much better, but I think real genius for adults is just to be able to revert back to your childhood spontaneity and imagination like that, to have ready access to that. So in many ways, an 11 or 12-year-old has much closer proximity to that time in their life, when I think they can use, for instance, their imagination as a tool to process trauma, to to explore, to be curious. I think we all have that. I think a lot of us suppress that and maybe lose that. And so a lot of, I think, the audition process, so to speak, was just encouraging that. And
I found it very almost painful emotionally, because every child has something special in a way.
Yeah.
Even the ones that aren't clearly right for the role or exceptionally talented, whatever that means, I found it really difficult, and especially when you start narrowing it down in terms of, oh, they're right for the age, they're right for this particular part. There were so many choices ultimately, and it's and the distinction that between them was quite subtle sometimes. And I just found the rejection of people ultimately to be even more painful than it is for adults. I found that process like almost traumatic for me. Like just because you start loving what they're doing and loving what they're bringing, and I found it, oh God, it was hard. That was hard.
Yeah, I mean,
unexpectedly, like really unexpectedly.
The empathy that you're talking about, I think it's inevitable. And I think you especially, having understanding, being both in front of and behind the camera, when one, I think it's helpful. I mean, when one is behind the camera, you realize, I think, how so often the reason someone didn't get a role had absolutely nothing to do with what they did in that space. And yet they probably don't know that always. They probably think that it was a rejection of them, as opposed to any constellation of factors that had nothing to do with them. I mean, I just read an interview. Someone sent me an interview a week ago with an actor who's on a hit TV show right now, an actor in his late 20s, who apparently had auditioned for The Spectacular Now a decade ago, and he's a brilliant actor, and it still kind of, I guess, sort of hurt him that he hadn't been cast in that film, and he was being, acclaimed for this fantastic role, and it stays with you. So I think it's there is the ethics. I think the ethics and morality structurally of how films are made, of the decisions that are made behind the camera and in Congress with the people that you're making with, they spill over into the film, and they're just as important as what is happening in front of the camera, I think, oftentimes.
I agree.
What do I do? What do I do? Do I answer or
Don't answer it.
I can't believe you just did that. That was my Christmas present. My only Christmas present.
We can get it fixed.
So that goes pretty elegantly into production. Did you have a rehearsal process with them at all? Were you able to get them you shot in Utah?
Yeah, we shot sort of in Salt Lake City and sort of some of the surrounding areas. Like,
were you able to bring everyone there early? I mean, we'll talk about your rehearsal process if you were able to have any of that.
Yeah, we had them all come out. I think they came out about a week before we shot, and with their parents. Yeah, and as you said, you really are casting a family. With 3 of the actors, they came with their mothers. 1 of the actors came with their father, and they all sort of became part of, I don't know, the extended family, the crew. Yeah, I'm not even sure what the correct language is, but they were just a presence and a welcome presence, because they know their children obviously better than anyone and are the best advocates for their kids. And so they're, they were invaluable, and we are grateful to them. So yeah, I mean, we just spent time we did read through scenes. I didn't want things to become overly set. Yeah, I really wanted it to feel alive. And a lot of it, what was important to me was both meeting in the collective, but then meeting one-on-one to just have conversations through scenes. Just like in this scene with your mom, well, would you say it this way? Like what feels, what are you thinking? Does this track? Like could you imagine doing this? If not, how would you do it? Just trying to get in their minds and trying to give them such a total sense of ownership of their character story.
I did the same thing. And I think that the word rehearsal is a misnomer for really what you're doing, because that implies that you're somehow setting things and like you're memorizing and making decisions about the text. And that's not it at all. It's more an exploration and introduction and answer, question and answering period where it's like, what doesn't make sense, you know, like yeah, just sort of beginning to explore ultimately.
Yeah, I've been reading, I'm not done with yet, but I've been reading that wonderful Mike Nichols biography. And, you know, it's interesting. I mean, he obviously had such a diverse and long career, and just reading about the many, many ways that he would rehearse for stage and film. And in some cases with a lot of control, with a proper rehearsal process. In some cases, especially later, it felt like there was a more loose, fluid, let's just tell each other stories and become comfortable and learn to trust each other kind of way, which, you know, with an invisible hand, perhaps, it probably always had a sense of what he wanted, but was open. You know, you hope that you're open to the universe giving you surprises.
Did you, you rehearse them individually? Did you rehearse them together? And did you rehearse them with their parents? Was there that kind of introduction as well? Did you have time for all that?
Yeah, I mean, it was most important to me that they, yes to all of that. I really wanted them to spend time together. That was the biggest thing. The actors, they were staying in the same hotel. And I think what I was excited about was just like, let's buy them pizzas and let them hang out.
Yeah,
like let's buy, and then.
So they start to begin to have their own language. I mean, you do that with adults as well, so that there's a comfort. So the first day on set is not, I'm sorry, what's your name again? It's like they already are joking with each other. They have their own little like dialogue that goes on. Yeah.
I mean, the pie in the sky dream, right, is that they, in this case, that they would have their own sort of shorthand and their own secrets that are with each other, that are independent of me, that I don't need to know. That you know, that for the characters would be something that they're remembering from 3 years ago that like was meaningful to them in the moment. To try to, I think, create a sort of Proustian sense memory of having spent time with each other and having attachments and connections.
And logistically, how old are they? What were your hours on set? And how many days did you shoot?
Yeah, the actors, when we filmed, were between the ages of 11 and 13.
Right.
I think it was 9 or 9.5. I'm forgetting how it works out with the time that they had to have with it was during the summer, but with their teacher.
Right.
But I think 9.5, and we were 25 days.
So something that a lot of people probably don't know about is, depending on your age, obviously with child labor laws determines how many hours a day they get to shoot. And we had like this running clock. We're like, well, we'd lose the younger kids, you'd lose them at a certain time, but the scene's not done. Given that your kids are all the same age, did you have to have any organizational strategy about how you attack the day in terms of losing kids, and then like, we're going to shoot the kid scenes and then get the parents, but the kids are in that scene. So how do we shoot that? Are we shooting the parents' side? Like, did you have that math at all to contend with?
We had that math, and it was math. It was like a structure, was creating a Jenga pyramid type structure that that could topple easily. And in our case, there was just very little margin for error. And because of the 4 young actors are in almost every scene, you really couldn't roll scenes that much where there was a few moments where it was the adults independent of the kids, but for the most part it was just, if you think that a typical, so to speak, like production day is 12 hours, and if you're removing several hours from that because it's all kids, over the course of a week you're losing about a day, you know. So really functionally we made it in, I don't know what it works out to, like 20-ish, around 20 days probably, when you think of the time that we had. But yes, we were constantly aware of that. And we never wanted to be in a place where we were, you know, nobody wants to be in a place where you're in mid scene and it's exactly that time and the actors have to go, because they really do. And we took it very, very seriously. And because of COVID, additionally, everything, I think the intentionality, the thought, the gratitude, I think that we all had, that we were getting to make something in the first place, was huge. So we took those, you know, the timing, the protocol, and just the basic etiquette of how to be on set with each other very, very seriously. And there really were families on set, not just, I mean, mine was there. I mean, the actors' families and some of the crew had their family there as well. So
when did you shoot?
We shot in summer 2021, and it was as you may or may not remember, it's when a lot of the Western parts of America were on fire. So we had this sort of, between the heat, COVID, and just distant looming smoke, there was a kind of somewhat apocalyptic vibe, yeah, going on, which a sense of dread around the edges, which weirdly, again, yeah, it was appropriate, because this is about kids in the middle of childhood, in the middle, or at least the waning days of summer, with like dark shadows around the edges of it.
Yeah.
You're all gonna look back on this moment and realize just how dumb you were. But doesn't mean you shouldn't have fun. Bye, girls. I hate teenagers.
Did the logistics of having children in every scene, or how did it affect the photography, how you chose to film it? I mean, obviously there's a kind of, you're making thematic choices with but just logistically too. Did you decide, okay, we're going to shoot all handheld, or we're never going to shoot handheld, or like, did you have a strategy in terms of making your days, but also in terms of creating an environment for the kids that felt open and nimble?
Yeah, I mean, my collaboration with Greta Zazula, our cinematographer, was one of the closest I had on the film.
Have you worked with them before?
I had not worked with Greta before. She was located on the East Coast. I'm on the West Coast. I had been a fan. I had seen her work. I mean, she made a couple amazing films that I really love. One called Light from Light, one called The Half of It, one called Materna. But I had seen initially a rough cut of a film. I was a mentor years ago at the Austin Film Society. Has a director's lab. I was a mentor for a few days, and it was actually at Richard Linklater's ranch. They had a screening of a rough cut of a film that had been supported the year before, a film called Never Going Back, that a really great director named Augustine Frizzell had directed. It was her first film. She went on to do the pilot for Euphoria. But I was really struck. It was a story about two female stoners, two high school stoners, and just had this, it had a sense of class in Texas that like I could relate to, being from a similar area in Georgia, and it was funny and alive and both beautiful. And I think that was when I first was aware of Greta as a cinematographer. And so for over a year, she and I would just get on Zoom, get on the phone, and just talk through scenes, share images, talk about films. And there's a really beautiful, she's very intentional. And I think like what was really important to us was initially we were going to just talk through, and before we shot list, maybe even storyboard everything. That was sort of this idea, at least. What if we did that? And then very quickly, we began just talking a lot about the scenes and saying, if there was one image, and maybe this is almost like the Walter Murch idea in editing in reverse, but if there was one image for each scene that would be emblematic of that would distill down the scene to a single word, what would that image be? Yeah. And that was really actually where we operated from. We knew early, it was very important to me that subjectivity, and I think films that contain multiple subjectivities benefit all of us, but the subjectivity of these young women at this specific age was the position and the point of view that we should be operating from as an audience. And so I really wanted Greta to be a fifth character, a fifth friend to some degree. And that did not in this case mean handheld faux verite documentary. We were pretty clear from the beginning that it would not be that there would be sort of an elegance, that there would be steady cam, but in places,
right?
Yeah, just an intentionality, and that we wanted to dignify these snapshots from childhood in a way, and that we both were fans of aberrations that come from old glass in front of on a camera, and that we talked a lot about the quality of light and the fading days of summer, and how the difference between nostalgia and sentimentality, and really trying to avoid sentimentality and not just having everything feel sun-kissed because it's summer, for instance, and in fact, quite the opposite.
Was Utah chosen specifically? Was that in the script, or was that a financial decision?
It was like a natural evolution, to be honest. I mean, I had spent a lot of time in Utah, both because of things related to Sundance, and then I'd ridden a bicycle one summer across America, actually, but part of it involved going across Utah. So it was a state that I've always loved and has always captured my imagination. I do think it's one of the most beautiful states in the country. In this case, we didn't want to make a tourism film about the natural beauty of Utah.
Yeah.
But I'd always been struck by, I had gone in and out of Salt Lake City a lot on my way to Park City. And then as I'd driven around Salt Lake City, I just found it fascinating. There is kind of a universality to it, but there's industrial sprawl, there's different types of neighborhoods, there's class that really can be represented on film, all of these things that I found super compelling. And Jen Dana, my producer, she had made a movie called Brigsby Bear there. And when I wrote the script, I really wrote it around my backyard, around the Arroyo Seco, which is the dry riverbed that runs through Northeast Los Angeles. And sort of the bridge was the Colorado Street Bridge, which some people know as Suicide Bridge, although there's multiple old bridges that run across it. And I think what was important to me was that where these kids go is somewhere that's close to where they live. It's sort of, but when you're 10 or 11 or 8 or 9, whatever it is, that you can be only 10 minutes from your parents' home, but you can be in a place that feels as big as, as Terabithia, as big as your imagination can conceive. And the type of place, it was important to me that a lot of it be a place where kids could create a Terabithia that you could imagine once they became teenagers, that's where you go to smoke pot. When you go a little older, like it's the exact same place that as you get older, you go there to get away from people that would be watching you, but it's not actually that far away.
I ask about the location because I found myself every once in a while being like, where are we? It was both incredibly specific and very, in a positive way, generally American. Like there were so many identifiable things that I grew up in Oregon and England, but yeah. At the end, there's like a cul-de-sac at the end of one of the streets where you could see the barriers before the natural environment started. And I was like, I know that street. Like that is so specific. And at one point I paused it because they were walking down a main street. And I didn't know if you were on the East Coast or where you were. And then I was trying to look at the license plate to see, and I couldn't identify. It was white with blue lettering. And I guess that's Utah, but I didn't know. And I was like, I don't know. It was so, I don't know if what I'm saying it may even make sense, but it felt very, it felt very specific. And yet at the same time, I didn't know exactly where we were, but it was so clearly like Americans Exurbia or something. I don't know, that felt very real to me. So it was very effective. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, it's sort of I have family everywhere around the country as well. And I think sort of what I've begun to feel more is that state by state, there are differences to some degree based on, but a lot of times it's like you said, you grew up in Oregon, like whether you're east or west of the Cascades, just north and south, you start to feel your proximity to mountains, your proximity to water, your proximity to a downtown skyline that can sort of, with skyscrapers, those things can affect you much more, I think. And, there were, as we were scouting around, obviously there's almost too much beauty in Utah. And I think what I really wanted, it was like, let's have nothing that could be a postcard. That was really smart. We had to frame out like beautiful mountains. Oftentimes it was like, nope, we can't use this because there's a beautiful mountain range. It's very important to me, actually, having lived or spent a lot of time in upstate New York and New Jersey and Georgia and Florida and California and other places, that I wanted it to feel in a way like it is set now. I mean, there is technology of now, but the kids don't fetishize their technology too much. But I wanted it to feel like maybe a memory of childhood, like a childhood, a memory of childhood, maybe a dream of childhood and a nightmare of childhood all at the same time, in a way, because I think that's also what childhood can feel like.
You are to be commended for that. I think that must have been very difficult because, one is always aware of creating beautiful photography and attempting to make it sort of satisfying in that way for an audience and beautifying it. And I think it would have been very tempting and very easy if you're in Utah with that natural beauty to incorporate that, but it would have given a sentimentality that I think it doesn't need and didn't want.
Yeah.
The lack of that gave it a real strength. I think it gave the environment you were creating a far more authenticity in a way, I would say.
Thank you.
Because then you start focusing on the interiors, the house, what each house feels like, you know, what environment, and there's no information you're given, which is great. I mean, you know that like what like Belle does for a living, but I don't know. I mean, maybe it was said what some of the other parents did, but you're kind of looking at what they are and at what their homes look like and the interior of those homes, and that becomes more of the landscape, which is very pretentious but true, I think.
It's the hope, and it's like, as you know so well, it's like how you articulate, how you, in a way that's internal and logical to the characters and their relationships first, but that also does have an attention to structural issues related to, say, class, like how you can articulate those things through very intentional choices and locations that you're choosing and homes that you're choosing in what you're filming and what you're not filming, how you let that be a subtextual part of the story that is hopefully felt but is never, you know, hugely hit on the head. It's casting locations, so the way you would cast actors and being just.
I'm going to give you an A+ for that.
Thank you.
Now that I think of it, I remember sneaking some whiskey from my dad's stash at a sleepover in the 5th grade.
I mean, I know what you're saying, but Mari just would not do that. I know her.
Well, I didn't think my daughter was secretly watching all the murder shows I can't seem to get enough of. So I guess we were all a little clueless.
Yeah, but Mari's kind of a prude. Like,
Yeah, I'll stand by.
she gets mad at me when I swear.
Before we wrap up, because I know there's a time concern, I want to talk about two things really quickly, which is just, was there any adaptation during shooting? Because you have this film with 4 children in it. Was there anything that was unexpected that you started to do in terms of the photography or the acting or your direction? Or is there anything that happened that you had to accommodate or that needed to be accommodated? And then I'm curious how that went into editorial, if there was any surprises in terms of how you cut the children or how the script changed. That's like 12 questions in there, but maybe you could riff on that, because I think that's part of it. Something we do with adults anyway. This script is a living thing that changes in production and in editorial, but with children, I had to do some adaptation that was specific, and I'm just curious what you did.
Yeah, I mean, it was, you know, there were things that were movable and things that were immovable. I mean, there were aspects of this story that really were interested in the character's imagination and the way that guilt or anxiety would be projected and things that they would think that they would see but would not be there. Things like that had to be hyper specific in the way that they were shot. If in some cases like storyboarded in a way that like,
Right.
no,
It's very specific pictorial storytelling where it's like
Yes.
from the eyes to the window to the yeah.
and that we would need, but I also know that my very favorite, when I'm most, I think, moved by performances in an ensemble of young people, a lot of times it's just scenes that are playing in a master where it's 4 people in a frame bouncing off of each other, and it was trying to create a space for both of those, you know, to tell a story that had a plot, that had a thing that happened, but to create that life and to not have a lot of time and to pull it off, you know, and with younger actors, I think a lot of times, you know, there's different gems, there's different bounty to be had as far as like gifts of just spontaneity that are there, but it can be, it doesn't have to be, but it can be very different than working with an actor who is 30, who is a classically trained actor, who is take to take, knows exactly where the camera is, knows exactly where the lights are, you know.
But on that note specifically, I noticed there were a lot of masters, or there seemed to be. So were you shooting from multiple angles? Did you have more than one camera? Because I know that the tendency or the desire, obviously, is if you have a bunch of people in a master, well, this person, you may not be getting exactly what you hope for performance-wise, while this person's on fire the whole way through. So you kind of have a desire to go in for close-ups or to get all the material. And you didn't, you know, one of the ways around that is obviously rehearsal, but if there's improvisation, or it's very difficult. It's a very complex equation. So was that something I mean, I'm just curious, like, was there
Yeah.
Put them in the masters, or were you just like, well, this is so great that I'm going to compromise here, or it's different and I'm happy?
I heard, this is a roundabout answer to that. I heard once Harris Savides, when he was talking about Last Days, the film he made with Gus Van Sant, or maybe it was Gus Van Sant talking about working with Harris Savides. I forget which way it was, but they just, so much of that film was just each room in that big house was just a shot, and like the Michael Pitt would sort of move in and out of the house, and when he was in that room, that's how it was. And they wouldn't light, I'm paraphrasing, they wouldn't light for the actor, they would light for the space, and sometimes people fall into shadows, and sometimes you can't see them perfectly, and that's kind of how it is in life. And I sort of really wanted to embrace that there was, it's okay if sometimes someone is saying something off camera. It's okay if we didn't capture everything, and to be frank, we didn't have like the luxury of time to cover everything from every single angle. It wouldn't have been the most interesting film, to me at least, and we couldn't do it anyway.
I have one final question, which is just, I don't know where you are in the promotion of this film or the discussion of this film, but is there anything that you wished someone would ask you about that you thought was special to this experience that you want to highlight or just talk about? Because sometimes I think what ends up happening is that there are some obvious questions. Each film has obvious questions or obvious discussion points. And sometimes there's things that are just buried that you might feel like, whether it's a logistical thing or a narrative thing. I'm just curious if there's anything that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm early, like I'll be talking to a lot of people, like you're first of the day, and I'll be talking to a lot of people today and tomorrow. I mean, I think the things that I was attempting, I think, both narratively, I think there were, there's multiple tones and genres to some degree. It is a coming of age story. It is to some degree, like it is a neo-noir story about people following, trying to discover something and using not a female body as an object or prop, but in fact a male body in a constellation of films and a deep universe of narratives that usually involves the female body being used as a prop for men to either discover something or understand something about themselves or to save someone. This was, I was really deeply interested in the the subjectivity of these characters and their experience, and how it might be unique from other subjectivities. And again, I think we all benefit when there's stories told, from different subjectivities.
I agree. That's a subject that we didn't get a chance to talk about, but we have a film written by two men, directed by a man, starring and featuring and focusing on 4 young women and their mothers primarily.
Yeah.
And that's a whole other discussion. I was curious about why that lens, but I don't think we have time, but you sort of touched on it there. Thank you everyone for tuning in and listening to James talk about his wonderful new film. And James, is there anything you want to say as we wrap up here?
Yeah, I thank you so much for having such a thoughtful conversation with me. I'm such a huge fan of yours. So this meant the world to me. Summering is now available for you to watch at home. I hope you check it out and enjoy it. Thank you.